Now that we've got a little better picture of some of the ethical responsibilities of morticians and coroners, and also some of the ways in which their codes of ethics are problematic or maybe poorly defined, we want to look more closely at this possibility that for morticians who also serve as coroners, there may be important ethical worries related to conflicts of interest. And so that's what we're going to focus on in this clip and the next, and then we'll conclude with just some other general sort of examples of the kinds of ethical questions that morticians and funeral directors have to deal with, just to sort of give us a full view of what the ethics of morticians and coroners might look like as a field of further study. First thing we should do here, though, just because I assume some of you are not entirely clear about this, first thing we should do is just distinguish morticians from coroners so that it's clear, what these roles involve. Morticians are employed by the family of the deceased, and their job is to make final arrangements for the body, prepare the body, organize memorial services, arrange for transport of the body to, not only the funeral home where the body's prepared, but also to the cemetery, arrangements for a plot, etc. And in some cases, morticians also perform these services. And another thing that morticians do that's not often recognized, but that I know draws a lot of people to the field, is that they often do a fair bit of bereavement counseling and grief counseling, simply because there's a lot of opportunity for open, frank discussion about the loss that the family has incurred. And so many people who find this field appealing, it's because of the opportunity to help families through what is a difficult time for almost everyone. I've heard morticians describe their job as equal parts businessman, party planner, and psychologist, because they're sort of doing all of these things at once. And there are other aspects of the role as well. I mean, it is weird to say party planner. I mean, that may be an sort of incorrect word choice on my part. But the point there is just that they're arranging an event. They're an event planner in addition to being a grief counselor and a scientist for those who are involved in the embalming process. I mean, they're also sort of a skilled craftsman or craftswoman, as well as a scientist of certain sorts. There's a lot to this job. And this is regarded as a full-time profession with specialized training. Morticians do this, every day. They don't. It's not something they do. It's not a side job or a part-time job. It's a full-time career, and it can be very demanding. There's no sort of schedule for when people die. It happens at all hours of the night. Okay, so let's contrast morticians with coroners, who are not employed by families, but by some sort of governmental agency, usually a local, county or possibly state government. And there are federal coroners as well. But local coroners actually do the majority of the work. And their job is to determine cause of death. Because what coroners do is, number one, determine cause of death for life insurance purposes. There are certain kinds of causes of death that are not covered, specifically suicide. And also to determine whether there's need for a criminal investigation. That's sort of a substantial role for coroners. And often, especially in smaller towns, and this is where this mortician conflict of interest issue comes up most prominently, coroner is often a part-time occupation. It's usually filled by not only morticians, but also nurses, physicians, sheriffs can serve as coroners. Usually it's someone with legal or medical training who is specifically trained to determine cause of death and evaluate those kinds of issues. And it's pretty rare for this to be a full-time job, especially in these sort of smaller, more rural communities. Places like Bowling Green. Bowling Green most likely I believe, does not have a full-time coroner. I sort of did a little investigating when I've done this class in person to try to get this person to come in and talk to the class, and they basically said, no, I don't want to do that. I believe there are two physicians who sort of share the job, but it is not a full-time position. It's sort of on an as-needed basis, because Bowling Green's not a big enough community to warrant a full-time coroner. All right, now that we have a sense of the difference between a coroner and a mortician, let's just talk generally about conflicts of interest. And these are going to be conflicts of interest that come up just for people who act as coroners, because the problem is that they have other jobs, and they often have other jobs that are affected by the kinds of work they do as the coroner. And so one of the ways that we might find a conflict of interest is the problem that we've already sort of touched on of steering business toward themselves. So if this is a mortician, this is going to include things like recommending their mortuary, because coroners have a kind of privileged access to the family when they're on scene. And especially when the family doesn't have anyone in particular in mind, which is pretty often. People often have not specified where they want their body to go, if they've even specified how they want their body to be treated once they die. In those kinds of cases, being on scene with the family when they first find out about their loved one's death gives the coroner or the mortician coroner a substantial advantage in procuring business. Now, this isn't the only way that this steering business toward oneself conflict can come up. Some coroners are also pathologists. They operate pathology labs. And when there is testing that has to be done as part of the determining cause of death process, coroner pathologists might benefit by recommending their own labs for that autopsy-related testing. So that's just a couple of ways that we might see a conflict of interest with regard to steering business towards your regular full-time profession. Another obvious source of conflict of interest is presenting findings in a way that actually benefits the coroner themselves. For example, a mortician coroner might identify a suicide as an accidental death, which will allow for insurance payouts, and there's the opportunity for a kind of illicit exchange between the coroner and the family. That, hey, look, I'll rule this a suicide, I'll rule this an accidental death, and you're going to come to my funeral home and you're going to order the most expensive casket I have, because otherwise you're not going to get your money. Mortician coroners are in a unique position to be able to negotiate those kinds of deals because they have control over determining cause of death. There might also be motivations related to social status, community perception, or religious issues. Most of this comes up in the context of suicide. It may be really bothersome to find out that your pastor of your church, for example, killed themselves. So if you're the coroner, you may be tempted to rule their death an accident because you find it personally upsetting to think that they might have killed themselves, or perhaps you think it would be upsetting for the community, and maybe the community would, lash out at you for coming to this kind of determination about their, the beloved community pastor or something like that. So those are a couple ways that there might be a conflict of interest with regard to presenting the findings in ways that are self-interested. There can also be conflicts of interest related to presenting findings in a way that protects the full-time professional organization of the coroner. For example, if the sheriff is also the coroner, they might downplay the details of, say, the death of an inmate at a prison facility that they are responsible for, because it will create the impression that that their facility is unsafe if they were to sort of reveal gruesome, gory details of this person being killed. That's a case where the sheriff coroner might be tempted to rule a death as a suicide instead of as a sort of violent stabbing on a prison yard, because that's going to look bad for the sheriff. Another kind of example is if an ER nurse is a coroner, they might want to make determine cause of death in a way that looks favorably upon the ER. So the basic idea here is just that because coroner is a part-time position filled often by people who have other roles and other professions that are their full-time profession, there is incentive for them to present findings in a particular way that's sort of good for them as individuals or good for their profession or something like that. Now, in the reading that we looked at about this, and that reading is what this discussion is based on, there was a study done, or actually several studies done, on how people feel about the idea of different professional roles occupying the position of coroner. And in these studies, there tends to be agreement that when sheriffs and nurses serve as coroners, that's not ethically problematic. The thought is that the nature of their full-time profession just overrides any self-interested motivation that they might have. So there's a thought that, when you're a nurse, you're committed to certain kinds of values. You're committed to a certain kind of community role that just rules out doing things that will be sort of personally beneficial or that will benefit your hospital or your sheriff's office or something like that. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that's how people felt about this and this was a study done on coroners themselves, so people who serve as coroners. Mortician coroners, however, were seen less favorably. And there was pretty widespread agreement that when the coroner is also a mortician, unlike when the coroner is a nurse or a sheriff or a physician, there is serious concern about conflict of interest. And I think that really, I'm just sort of playing armchair social scientist here, but I think that's probably because the benefits that mortician coroners can accrue are very individualized. It's probably good for the ER nurse's hospital if she or he presents findings that don't cast the hospital in a negative light. But the benefits for a mortician coroner are much more, direct, noticeable, measurable, and significant. And so there's a worry that the risks associated with mortician coroners are just much higher. Okay, so the question is about, just sort of the general theme of this clip, ways that mortician coroners can face conflicts of interest. So go ahead and take care of that, and then we'll look at a couple of arguments against having morticians serve as coroners, and then we'll conclude again with just some other general ethical issues that morticians may face in their everyday practice.